The ground began to move without warning, as it does. In an instant, across the green mountains and valleys of central Colombia, the earth heaved and shuddered with tremendous violence. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake tearing through the region and striking hardest at the city of Pereira, one of the jewels of Colombia's famous coffee country. Buildings that had stood for decades trembled, cracked, and in the worst cases collapsed, sending debris into the streets and dust into the air. Walls fell, roofs caved, and the people of Pereira and the surrounding region were plunged into the terror and chaos that only a great earthquake can bring. A sudden and total upheaval of the solid ground beneath their feet. This is the story of that disaster, of why Colombia is a land shaken by earthquakes, of why a city like Pereira sits in such danger, of what happens when the earth unleashes this kind of power against a populated region, and of how a nation responds to and recovers from one of the most feared of natural catastrophes. The restless ground beneath Colombia. To understand why an earthquake of this magnitude would strike Colombia, you first have to understand the restless geology that lies beneath this beautiful country, because Colombia is a land shaped and endangered by some of the most powerful forces on the planet. Colombia sits in one of the most seismically active regions of the world, a place where the great plates of the Earth's crust grind and collide, building up the tension that is released in earthquakes. Off the western coast of Colombia, beneath the Pacific Ocean, one of the great tectonic plates is slowly diving beneath the edge of the South American continent, a process known as subduction, in which one enormous slab of the Earth's crust descends beneath another. This grinding collision, unfolding over millions of years, is what has built the towering Andes Mountains that run down the spine of Colombia, and it is also what makes the region so prone to earthquakes. The subduction off the coast is only part of the story, because the immense forces generated by this collision do not stay confined to the coast, they reach inland, fracturing the crust of the continent into a complex web of geological faults. These faults, running through the mountains and valleys of Colombia, are the lines along which the crust breaks and shifts when the accumulated stress becomes too great, and it is the sudden movement along these faults that produces earthquakes. Colombia is laced with such faults, a network of fractures created by the relentless pressure of the plates, and among them are major fault systems that run directly through the populated heart of the country, including the mountainous coffee-growing region where Pereira lies. This is the fundamental reason for the danger. Colombia is a country built upon restless, fractured ground, where the great forces of the earth are constantly at work, and where the release of those forces in an earthquake is not a question of if, but of when. The beauty of the Colombian landscape, its dramatic mountains and fertile valleys, is itself a product of these very forces, so that the same geology that makes the country so magnificent also makes it so dangerous. To live in Colombia is to live upon ground that has always been, and will always be, capable of the kind of violent upheaval that struck Pereira. Why the coffee region is so vulnerable. The region around Pereira holds a special and painful significance in the story of Colombian earthquakes, because this coffee-growing heartland, one of the most beloved and productive parts of the country, sits in a position of particular vulnerability, and understanding why illuminates the danger that the region faces. Pereira lies in the mountainous central region of Colombia, in the zone known for its coffee cultivation, a landscape of steep green slopes and fertile valleys where much of the country's famous coffee is grown. This region is beautiful and prosperous, densely populated with cities and towns and farms, and it sits directly upon some of the major fault systems that run through the Colombian Andes, placing it squarely in the path of the seismic danger. The vulnerability of the coffee region is not merely a matter of geology, but also of history and of the built environment. This is a region that has been struck by earthquakes before, sometimes with devastating consequences, and its cities and towns have grown up over generations in the shadow of this danger. The steep mountainous terrain of the region adds to the peril, because earthquakes in mountainous areas can trigger landslides, sending slopes of earth and rock crashing down upon roads, homes, and communities, compounding the destruction of the shaking itself. The density of population in the coffee region means that a great earthquake striking there puts enormous numbers of people at risk. In cities like Pereira and the many other communities that dot the landscape, and the nature of the buildings in the region, some of them old, some of them not built to withstand strong earthquakes, adds another layer of vulnerability, because it is ultimately the failure of buildings that causes most of the death and injury in an earthquake. The coffee region, then, combines all the ingredients of seismic danger: active faults running directly beneath it, steep terrain prone to landslides, dense population, and a built environment of varying resilience. It is this combination that makes a place like Pereira so vulnerable, and that turns an earthquake striking the region into a potential catastrophe of the kind now unfolding. The shadow of a past disaster, the disaster striking Pereira, does not come without precedent, for the coffee region of Colombia carries the memory of a past earthquake that devastated it, a catastrophe that lives in the region's history and that shapes its understanding of the danger, and recalling it helps to place the current disaster in context. Years ago, this same coffee-growing region was struck by a powerful earthquake that caused terrible destruction, particularly in the nearby city of Armenia and the surrounding communities, killing large numbers of people and leaving a deep scar on the region. That earthquake, though not the largest in magnitude, struck close to the surface and directly beneath a populated area. And its effects were devastating, flattening buildings, killing and injuring many, and leaving a lasting trauma upon the people of the coffee region. The memory of that past disaster is important for understanding the present one, because it demonstrates that the danger to the coffee region is real and proven, not merely theoretical. The region has experienced firsthand the terrible power of an earthquake striking its cities, and the lessons of that catastrophe about the vulnerability of buildings, about the importance of preparedness and response, about the long and difficult road of recovery, are lessons written in the region's own painful history. That past earthquakes spurred efforts to improve the resilience of the region, to strengthen buildings and building codes, to enhance the capacity to respond to disasters, and these efforts, where they succeeded, may help to reduce the toll of the current earthquake. But the recurrence of a major earthquake striking the coffee region is a reminder that the danger never truly goes away, that a region built upon active faults will face earthquakes again and again across the generations, and that the work of preparing for and mitigating this danger is never finished. The shadow of the past disaster hangs over Pereira as it faces its own catastrophe, a reminder of what earthquakes can do to this region, and of the enduring nature of the threat that the restless ground beneath Colombia poses to the people who live upon it. What happens when the buildings fall at the heart of the disaster in Pereira, as in every great earthquake that strikes a populated area? Is the failure of buildings, because it is when buildings collapse that earthquakes become deadly, and understanding why buildings fall is essential to understanding the catastrophe. An earthquake itself, the shaking of the ground, does not directly kill most of the people who die in these disasters. Rather, it is the collapse of the structures in which people live and work that causes the great majority of deaths and injuries. When the ground shakes violently, buildings are subjected to forces they may not have been designed to withstand, forces that can crack their walls, buckle their supports, and, in the worst cases, bring them crashing down upon the people inside. The reason some buildings collapse while others survive comes down to how they were built. Buildings designed and constructed to resist earthquakes, with reinforced structures, flexible frames that can sway without breaking, and the strength to withstand the side-to-side forces of the shaking, can survive even powerful earthquakes with limited damage. But buildings that were not built to such standards, older structures, or those made of materials that are brittle and heavy and poorly reinforced, are far more likely to fail when the shaking comes, their walls cracking and their structures collapsing under forces they cannot bear. In a region like the Colombian coffee zone, where the building stock varies widely in age and quality, an earthquake will strike unevenly, sparing the well-built structures while destroying the vulnerable ones, and it is in the collapse of those vulnerable buildings that the human tragedy of the disaster unfolds. This is why the same earthquake can produce such different outcomes in different places and different buildings, and why the toll of a disaster depends so heavily not just on the magnitude of the earthquake, but on the resilience of the structures it strikes. In Pereira, as the buildings fall, it is this brutal logic that determines who is endangered and who is spared, the logic of construction meeting the violence of the shaking, and it is a logic that has made building safety one of the most important factors in reducing the deadly toll of earthquakes anywhere in the world. The chaos of the first hours in the immediate aftermath of a great earthquake, a region is plunged into a chaos that is difficult to imagine for those who have never experienced it, and the first hours after the disaster in Pereira would be a time of terror, confusion, and desperate urgency as the full scope of the catastrophe begins to reveal itself. The shaking itself lasts only seconds to a minute or so, but in those brief moments the world is transformed, and when the ground finally stills, the survivors emerge into a landscape of destruction, of collapsed buildings and rubble-strewn streets, of dust and debris and the cries of the injured and the trapped. The chaos of the first hours is compounded by the failure of the systems that normally hold a city together. Power lines may be down, plunging the region into darkness. Water and gas lines may be broken, cutting off supplies and creating new dangers of fire and contamination. Roads may be blocked by debris or damaged by the shaking or by landslides, hampering the movement of help. Communications may be disrupted, making it hard for people to reach loved ones or for authorities to coordinate a response. And amid all of this, the most urgent task of all begins: the search for survivors trapped in the collapsed buildings. A desperate race against time to reach those who may still be alive beneath the rubble before their injuries or the elements claim them. The first responders, often themselves victims of the disaster, work frantically alongside ordinary citizens who dig through the debris with their bare hands to try to save the trapped. The hospitals, if they have survived the shaking, are overwhelmed with the injured, straining to cope with a sudden flood of casualties. This is the chaos of the first hours, a time of maximum danger and maximum urgency, when the fate of many hangs on the speed and effectiveness of the response, and when the true scale of the disaster is still emerging from the dust and confusion. It is in these first hours that much of the life-saving must be done, and it is in these hours that the character and the preparedness of a community are tested as they rarely are. The danger that does not end, one of the most frightening aspects of a great earthquake, and one that shapes the disaster in Pereira in the days that follow the initial shock, is that the danger does not end when the main earthquake is over, because a large earthquake is almost always followed by aftershocks, and these can pose their own serious threats. When a major earthquake occurs, releasing the accumulated stress along a fault, the adjustment of the crust does not happen all at once. Instead, the region continues to settle and shift for some time afterward, producing a series of smaller earthquakes known as aftershocks that can continue for days, weeks, or even longer after the main event. These aftershocks, though generally smaller than the main earthquake, can still be powerful and dangerous. Buildings that were damaged but not destroyed by the main earthquake may be weakened and unstable, and an aftershock can finish the job, collapsing structures that were already compromised, sometimes bringing them down upon rescuers or survivors who had returned to them. The aftershocks add a continuing element of terror and danger to the aftermath, keeping the region on edge, complicating the rescue and recovery efforts, and posing an ongoing risk to everyone in the affected area. They are a reminder that the Earth, once it has begun to move, does not simply stop, that the release of seismic energy is a process that unfolds over time, and that the danger of a great earthquake extends well beyond the terrifying moments of the main shock. For the people of Pereira, the aftershocks would be a source of continuing fear and peril, reminders of the disaster that has struck them, and a continuing threat to their safety as they struggle to respond and recover. The danger that does not end is one of the cruelest features of earthquakes, prolonging the ordeal and adding fear to the already immense challenges of the aftermath. The response and the race to save lives as the scale of the disaster in Pereira becomes clear. A great response mobilizes, drawing on the resources of the city, the region, and the nation. And this response is the crucial factor that will determine how many lives are saved and how the region begins its recovery. Colombia, long familiar with the threat of earthquakes and other disasters, has developed systems and institutions for responding to such catastrophes, and in the wake of a great earthquake, these are called into full and urgent action. Emergency services, rescue teams, medical personnel, the military, and countless volunteers converge on the affected area, all focused on the paramount task of saving lives. The most urgent priority in the response is search and rescue, the effort to find and free the people trapped in the collapsed buildings while they may still be alive. Specialized rescue teams, using tools and techniques developed for exactly this purpose, work to locate survivors in the rubble and extract them safely, a painstaking and dangerous process that must be conducted with great care to avoid causing further collapse. Time is the enemy, for the chances of finding survivors diminish with each passing hour and day, making speed essential even as the danger of the work demands caution. Alongside the search and rescue, the response must care for the enormous numbers of people affected, the injured who need medical treatment, the displaced who have lost their homes and need shelter, food, and water, and the traumatized who need comfort and support. Shelters must be set up, supplies distributed, medical care provided, and order maintained, all in the chaotic and damaged environment of a disaster zone. This response is an enormous undertaking, straining the resources and the capacities of the region and the nation, and its effectiveness is measured in lives saved and suffering relieved. In the response to the Pereira disaster, the strength of Colombia's emergency systems and the courage and dedication of its responders are put to the ultimate test, and upon their success depends the fate of many. The long road to recovery, when the immediate emergency has passed, when the search for survivors has ended, and the injured have been treated. The affected region faces the long and difficult road of recovery, a process that will unfold over months and years, and that represents its own immense challenge, distinct from the drama of the disaster itself. The recovery from a great earthquake is a vast undertaking, encompassing the rebuilding of homes and buildings, the restoration of infrastructure, the revival of the economy, and the healing of the people who have suffered loss and trauma. It is a process that tests the endurance and the resources of a community long after the earthquake has faded from the headlines. The physical rebuilding is enormous in scale, requiring the clearing of rubble, the repair or replacement of countless damaged and destroyed buildings, and the restoration of the roads, power, water, and other systems on which modern life depends. This rebuilding offers an opportunity, if it is seized, to build back stronger and safer, replacing the vulnerable structures that failed with new ones designed to withstand future earthquakes, and in this way, reducing the region's vulnerability to the next disaster. But rebuilding is costly and slow, and it requires resources, planning, and will, and for many affected people, the loss of their homes and livelihoods imposes hardships that endure long into the recovery. Beyond the physical, there is the economic recovery, the revival of the businesses, farms, and industries that sustain the region, including the coffee cultivation for which it is famous, an economy disrupted by the disaster and requiring time to restore. And there is the human recovery, the healing of the deep wounds a catastrophe inflicts upon its survivors, the grief for those who were lost, the trauma of the experience, and the long work of rebuilding not just structures, but lives and communities. The road to recovery is long and hard, and it is walked by the people of the affected region for years after the earth has stilled. A reminder that the true cost of a great earthquake is measured not only in the terrible moments of the disaster, but in the extended struggle of recovery that follows. Living with the inevitable in the end, the disaster in Pereira, like every great earthquake, carries a lesson about the relationship between human beings and the powerful and different forces of the planet on which we live. A lesson about the necessity of learning to live with a danger that cannot be eliminated. Earthquakes cannot be prevented, and they cannot, despite much scientific effort, be reliably predicted. They strike without warning, releasing in moments the stress that has built up over years and decades along the faults beneath the surface. For a country like Colombia, built upon active and restless geology, earthquakes are not an aberration, but an inevitable feature of existence, a danger that has always been present and always will be, woven into the very land itself. The response to this reality is not despair, but preparation and resilience, the recognition that while earthquakes cannot be prevented, their toll can be greatly reduced through wise action taken before disaster strikes. Building structures that can withstand the shaking, enforcing building codes that require earthquake-resistant construction, educating people about how to protect themselves, and developing the capacity to respond effectively when disaster comes. All of these measures can dramatically reduce the death, injury, and suffering that an earthquake inflicts. The difference between a well-prepared community and an unprepared one when the earth shakes, is a difference measured in lives, and this is the most important lesson that a disaster like the one in Pereira can teach. That the danger is inevitable, but the catastrophe need not be. That human foresight and preparation stand as the great defense against the indifferent power of the shaking earth. As Pereira and Colombia face the disaster that has struck them, and as they respond and recover, they carry forward this hard-won understanding that to live upon the restless ground is to accept the reality of the earthquakes it will bring, and to meet that reality, not with fear alone, but with the determination to prepare, to protect, and to endure. The earth will shake again, in Colombia and in every seismic land, and the measure of a people is